Hi, everyone. Welcome to the New York Times in Education webcast on cultural awareness and sensitivity. I'm Kathleen O'Connell, National Education Director at the New York Times. We would love to have you join the conversation. Simply type your questions into the space provided, and I will pass them on to our speaker. We're pleased to have Sewell Chan with us today. Sewell is Deputy Opinion Page Editor of the New York Times. So Sewell, I read approximately 29% of the U.S. population are minorities, and demographic projections indicate an increase to 50% by 2050. What are your thoughts on this creating a new need for higher levels of cultural awareness and sensitivity?
Kathleen, that's a great question. First of all, thanks for having me participate in this webcast today. It's a great honor to be speaking with students from all over the country, and a real privilege as a journalist at the New York Times to be taking part in this. I think the country is going through tremendous, immense demographic change that we're only beginning to become aware of. A majority of new births in the United States are now to quote, minority families. The very definition of minority is obviously changing as our society becomes much more pluralistic. And as the population of non-Hispanic whites is projected to be less than 50%, as you point out, by around the year 2040. So I think it's creating immense needs for those of us who are involved in journalism to think about both the audience that we'll be reaching out to, the audience that will be reading us, consuming us, watching us, engaging us, but also about the kind of stories that we should think about covering and why they're important and how they're important and how to kind of reflect diversity in every form. When I think, I'm sort of often asked about sort of cultural questions surrounding culture and diversity, and I often have a little bit of difficulty, to be frank, answering those questions because I find the term culture to be very nebulous in many ways, or very vague. And let me be specific. In America, in many ways, we have a homogenized culture, right? I mean, Hollywood, television. We know that in many ways, Americans are actually becoming more similar, even as we're becoming more diverse. And by that I mean, for example, regional accents are generally on the decline in America. We did a very fun dialect quiz on the New York Times website that found that you could actually tell by what choice of words people use. Like, for example, soda versus pop is an obvious example. You could kind of tell where in the country they're from. That was very, very popular. But accents have actually declined. We're Americans are a very mobile nation. So in terms of culture, I'm often thinking about U.S. versus foreign cultures now, whereas I think when I was younger, I used to think about cultures within the United States. And in a way, only when I went overseas for the first time did it's sort of the classic story, but it takes like living overseas to feel really, really American, and that happened to me after college. I never left the United States until after university, and I went to England for graduate school, and it was there that I felt very, very American, and very much in a foreign land, which is bizarre because it's an English-speaking country. But so I find, diversity, it's a complex topic, but I think I generally try to think about diversity on every single level. I think too often it's reduced to only thinking about race and ethnicity. But I also think we need to think in America about religion, for example, about the increasing number of people who are the so-called nuns, who don't affiliate at all with any religious group. That's especially prevalent among people who are under 30. We need to think, obviously, about issues of gender and sexual orientation. Stories like same-sex marriage and employment discrimination continue to be very, very much in the news, and now increasingly transgender identity and issues around that. And then there's a huge debate in America around inequality, which I think does feed into this debate over culture, because there is a question of whether, the rich are in a way becoming their own kind of culture that's separated from either gated communities or with a set of private institutions that are separate from, quote, the rest of us. And I think that's a really important question to engage because diversity isn't just on the surface. We're obviously in an historic era in America with an African-American president, but have the underlying political dynamics fundamentally shifted from the Bush administration to now? That's very arguable. A lot of journalists and commentators and ordinary Americans really disagree on that question. Maybe it would help a little bit if I talked about my own personal background as a journalist, Kathleen, and how I came into this and why I do what I do, because I do think my background plays into it. I'm a second-generation American, and that's itself a kind of loaded term because people use different terms. My parents are immigrants from Asia. They were born in China and Hong Kong during World War II and immigrated here in the 1970s as economic migrants. They were working-class people looking for jobs and opportunities. My mother was a secretary and my father was a taxi cab driver. And I was the first in my family to be born in the US, the first citizen in my family because my parents were not naturalized until after I was born. And also, I was the first person in my family to go to college. So for me, part of becoming a journalist and what appealed to me about working as a journalist was the chance to actually talk and interact with people who were very, very different from me. I think growing up in a place like New York, you know, naturally you're exposed to people from a lot of different backgrounds. You sort of have to get along with people and have to be able to start conversations quickly, I think, with people who may look or talk or very, very differently from you. And I think that came very naturally to me when I was young. What didn't come naturally to me was talking to strangers. So I was always good at getting along with people, but the kind of impulsion, like in a way journalism helped me to sort of structure my dealings with the outside world in the sense that it gave me a reason and an impetus to come up to someone who may be completely unlike me and just to start asking questions. And that's fueled a lot of my career in journalism. I've been very lucky to work at two great newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times. When I was at the Washington Post, much of my time there was spent covering local politics in Washington, D.C., a majority African-American city, where the local politics were very, very much very much focused on African-American issues. And a lot of the leadership was really from the kind of civil rights movement. And that exposed me to a really interesting way of thinking about things. And then I also spent several months in Iraq as a war correspondent in 2004, and that was, again, very, very enlightening. I guess part of my, just to finish that thought, part of my education as a journalist has come really from just reporting and writing and talking to people from many, many different backgrounds, and just sort of finding an area of commonality. A lot of times, yeah, I do talk to taxi cab drivers in New York, and because I pay a lot of attention now to international issues, even if I haven't been to their country, I have at least some sort of frame of reference. I recently was talking to a cab driver who's from a Sikh family, and I know the Prime Minister of India is Sikh, and he's about to leave office, and has had a complicated record there, and we just had a really interesting conversation about him. One thing that I would suggest for students, and it's something that I wish I had done when I was younger, is to really have a chance to study foreign languages and to go overseas. I think the opportunities for going abroad now have expanded so much. They were much more limited when I was in college. And it wasn't until I was 20 years old that I ever left the United States. And I think in hindsight, I would have benefited from leaving America sooner, because you do learn about yourself the more you're outside your environment. But I think even if you don't have the opportunity to leave the country, it's very important to travel within America as well. I think some of my most memorable moments in the United States were for either work or for pleasure, or going to places that were quite different from New York. South Carolina, Louisiana, Wyoming, Idaho. I've counted recently, I've been to 32 of the 50 states, and I actually am not proud of that number. I wish it were much closer to all 50, but I have been to almost every part of the country, and I think that's been a very important part of my learning experience too. I could go on, or maybe Kathleen has some questions for me, ideally though, I'd love to hear some questions from the students.
Sure. And everyone, again, if you'd like to join the conversation, simply type your question into the space provided. So thank you, Sewell. What assumptions do we make about working across cultures, do you think, and how do you think those assumptions are developed?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, oftentimes, people who do anthropology or people who focus on kind of organizational dynamics talk about cultural differences between the individual and the group. And I think that that's not, sometimes people say, well, Asian cultures are more collectively oriented and Western culture is more individual oriented. I think that's probably too simplistic a breakdown, but I certainly have seen within my organization a big kind of range of personality types. Traditionally, a lot of people who do journalism, I think, are very individualistic because as a reporter especially, you've got to be out there finding the story. You're often working alone or just with a photographer, and you're going up to strangers and asking questions, but you're writing, which is sort of a solitary activity in many ways. But when you're editing or managing or being part of a team, it's a much more kind of collective enterprise. I often call it being in the hive. And I think the hive mentality is different from the kind of roamer mentality, and it's sort of so both kind of cultural practices have been a big part of my work experience, and I'd say that I think the key is to actually not have assumptions about where people are coming from and to be very, very open to listening, because you can't really work well with others until you first understand where they're coming from and what their own assumptions are.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question. What would you say to today's college students about courses they should take to broaden their cultural experience?
Sure. I think, especially for me at least, courses in history and the social sciences, well, it's actually, it kind of goes all over. I don't think it's specific to the discipline. I think it's specific to what it is you're trying to learn about. I would strongly advise, whether it's an anthropology course or history or political science or area studies or art history, trying to take a course that's specific to a region that you really know nothing about. Although I'm Chinese American, I had never studied China in any way, and my entire interest in college was understanding the United States better, studying American government and US history. But I did take one course about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and it was really mind-blowing for me. And I learned about so many things. The professor who taught that course ended up writing for me later on as an op-ed writer for the New York Times. And it was really, really eye-opening. And I would just recommend that kind of experience of just taking something, a literature course, something that's just very different from what your comfort zone is.
Great. Okay, we have another question. What challenges do you face as a journalist working in African American communities?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Especially when I was working in DC, it's a city that is undergoing a lot of demographic change. Recently, for the first time ever, the city is now half or slightly less than half African American. When I was there, it was a majority African American. It had been so since the 1950s. So DC is undergoing a process of gentrification that has been very painful for a lot of people. I thought for me it was a little bit of a cultural advantage that I frankly wasn't coming from the black-white paradigm. I was often the only person, in fact, in a room, like in a community meeting or at a religious, event or a civic kind of happening, who wasn't either white or black, and in a way that enabled me to kind of talk to people from both sides. I mean, what issues were culturally specific? I think understanding region, I think understanding faith. A lot of people that I worked with, that I've interviewed over the years from African American backgrounds, including in New York, have historic ties to, for example, the South, or sort of understanding their histories, also understanding the immense diversity within the African American community, the fact that it includes both, the descendants of people who've been here for hundreds of years and whose ancestors came involuntarily, but also the tremendous new diversity within the African American community that comes in the form of West African and other migrant communities from the West Indies, for example, the Caribbean, and in New York we've got all kinds, and the political and social dynamics really vary across these different subgroups.
Okay. Sewell, as a reporter, how did you begin conversations to learn about another's culture?
Well, I think you need to have a topic to broach, right? I think when I was a reporter, I usually had some reason for asking a question. I mean, you kind of have to, otherwise you have no way to structure the conversation. And you find over time that generally everyone has an opinion. It's just the only difference is, well, there are differences in their opinions, of course, obviously, but there are also different ways of eliciting that opinion. I think one of the hardest things is to learn to listen deeply, to not interrupt, to ask questions in a very open-ended fashion. We're often taught in journalism that you should not ask yes/no questions. You should ask questions that begin how or why, because questions like that actually elicit more open answers than the who, what, or yes/no variety.
Okay. How did you come to join the Times op-ed page? Is it what you expected?
No, it wasn't at all what I expected. I had been a reporter here for almost 6 years, and I was most recently as a reporter in our Washington bureau writing about economic policy when the position of deputy op-ed editor opened up. And I've never been someone who's been particularly all that opinionated. I mean, I think I certainly have my own opinions, but I don't have an ideology or a worldview that I bring to the table. And in a way, I think that was very helpful for my coming to the op-ed page, because my job is not to have opinions. It is to read a very wide range of opinion writing about topics both international and domestic, and to find what are the most interesting, provocative, powerful opinions that we can offer our readers. We've done some of the essays that we've done that have gone completely viral. We did one by Warren Buffett about why the super rich should not be coddled, and it became this major national event, and President Obama invited Warren Buffett's secretary to the State of the Union because the secretary was paying a higher share of her income in taxes than Warren Buffett was. We edited a very powerful essay by Angelina Jolie, the actress and advocate, about her decision to have a mastectomy because she has a genetic mutation that would have made her predisposed to developing breast cancer. We had Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, writing about why the U.S. should not intervene in Syria. And all these were in some ways very controversial or provocative opinions by famous people. And those have been some of the highlights, because the chance to really use the New York Times opinion pages to give that powerful platform to people. Most of them are not famous. And in fact, I think, I gave 3 examples of people who are in some ways famous or powerful, but we've had a lot of writing by people who are either imprisoned. We had someone who was a Guantanamo hunger striker, giving voice to the voiceless as well. But the ability to use that platform to help shape public debate is what motivated me to take on this role.
Okay. The next question, there are actually 4 questions, so I'm going to break it in
Wow.
half to
Okay.
make it a little easier. Recently in the news, there has been some discussion about insensitivity that happened at the University of Mississippi. How are cultural sensitivity and racial sensitivity similar?
That's a great question. I think it really depends on the context. The history in the Deep South, or in the South specifically the 11 former Confederate states, is particularly raw. It's striking to me in many ways that it took until 2014 for a film as powerful as 12 Years a Slave to be made. I watched Roots. I'm a little bit too young to have seen the very original screening in 1976. I missed that, but I did watch it as a child, and that was very powerful as well. But I think understanding America's relationship to African Americans and Native Americans, and these 2 specific populations, and in a way the kind of original sin of American history relates to the deep suffering and pain that was inflicted on these populations. So I think understanding the Mississippi story in that context is important. And that's a story that involves both culture and race, because in Mississippi, people have lived side by side, both integrated and segregated, but very intimately and yet also separately for many, many generations. And I think that's what makes that story particularly painful. I mean, Ole Miss was obviously one of the universities where segregation was especially fraught. So I think that story has particular resonance.
Okay, and do you think, or how can student leaders make an impact on their campus when it comes to cultural awareness and sensitivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it is just reaching out. I think a big part of the college experience, at least for me, was getting to meet people from very different parts of the country and people who are very different from me. Roommates, friendships, blocking groups. I think the key is to actually not be with people who are very similar to you, and to use classroom and extracurricular interactions as an opportunity to maximize your chance of your exposure to people who are very different from you, and to have the courage to do that.
Okay, we have another question. What do you think is more important, understanding humanity or understanding people as individuals?
That is really deep. I don't think it's an either or. I'm certainly a student of philosophy and psychology, and I like theories about the human condition generally. Why do people suffer? Why is there injustice? Why does evil happen, right? These profound questions that go to the heart. Why do innocent people suffer? That's in a way the part of a universal and ethical conversation that I think ties us all together as people. But then, of course, when you actually are interested in individual stories, then it's at the individual level, and it's not at the group or the universal level. It's someone's individual motivations, and people who might, on the surface, look very, very similar. They might be from the same culture, speak the same language. I mean, obviously, have very, very different individual motivations. So I think it's a combination of both, that we all have a degree of individual choices, but they're framed by the kinds of backgrounds and environments where we come from and live in.
Okay. What is one small step students can take to become more culturally aware?
Yeah, I tried to address this earlier by just making sort of friends outside one's own group. I think I think studying a language is actually really helpful.
How about reading the New York Times?
I certainly think that reading news is a vital, vital part of understanding diversity. And I think actually, I wasn't going to make a plug for the Times, but actually, I think I should. Whatever news source you read, I do think it's very, very important to read the news. And I do think that one thing that unites us, sadly, as Americans is that we don't know enough about foreign countries. I went to Mexico last year for the very first time, and when you think about, Mexico, and not only is it one of our largest trading partners economically, but more Mexicans live in the United States than any other source country, and more Americans, intriguingly, live in Mexico than in any other country. I think there's something like 2 million Americans, many of them retired, who live in Mexico. But that is such a profound fact alone. And one of the things that surprised me when I went to Mexico is that, my friends, even at the New York Times, asked, well, why aren't you going to these resorts or a beach or Cancun or something? And I would say, no, my interests are really on history, and I need to understand, I want to have a deep understanding. So I just spent my entire week in Mexico City, and all I did was explore history and culture, because for me, that's essential to understanding kind of a way of life for a people. But my regret is that I don't speak, any language other than English fluently. I know smatterings of Chinese and Spanish. I studied French in high school and college, but I never really learned a language super well, and that's a regret. I would advise anyone in college to study a foreign language.
It's never too late.
It never is.
Okay, another question. If cultures conflict, what is the best way as a journalist to stay neutral in your writing and reporting?
Yeah, I think that's just the essence of good journalism, is to talk to everyone involved, and to not assume that there's only two sides. There's often 4 or 6 or 8, or often within each side there are different individual angles. I think the key to effective journalism is curiosity, and the key to genuine curiosity is not entering a conversation with any assumptions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and we have one more question. What are your future plans? What do you hope to accomplish concerning cultural awareness and sensitivity?
I think I'm certainly very, very happy to be at the New York Times, which is not only one of America's foremost news and information organizations, but I think a company that really cares deeply about diversity, about reflecting the changing America and the changing world that we're in. I think one of the challenges and opportunities the Times has right now is to become an international news brand, and to reach out to English reading audiences around the world, wherever they live. One of the great opportunities of our time is that you can really, for the first time in history, access the New York Times almost anywhere. Like someone with a mobile phone in Kenya can get the New York Times, just as someone living in San Francisco can. And just as this company became a national news organization in the 1990s and 1980s, so now it is becoming in many ways an international one. But at the same time, we also have to reflect the immense changes within our own society. And so one of the things I hope to bring is, to whatever extent it's useful, my background as, someone from a working class family, someone, a person of color, to be part of the conversation that's at the Times, and to contribute, what I can in terms of my own insights, but also in terms of my abilities to listen to other people and broaden the conversation both internally and outside.
Great. Thank you so much, Sewell, and thank you everyone for joining us.